Well, good evening and welcome everyone to this evening's meeting of Ealing Business Partnership, indeed the annual meeting of the Ealing Business Partnership. I'm Andrew Dakers, the independent chair of the partnership, and I'm delighted to be joined by officers, councillors, and a few members of the business community online and indeed in the room this evening for what will hopefully be a rich discussion. We have a fairly full agenda, and my expectation is we may get through it in an hour or so. So if folk have got other plans for this evening, that's how the night will pan out. Do we have any apologies for absence? I shall ask first of all.
We have apologies from Councillor Nagpal.
Thank you. I don't think we have any urgent matters tonight, unless I'm advised otherwise. So any declarations of interest, I suppose particularly from councillors in the room, that need to be flagged?
I just wanted to say that I sit on the High Street Task Force. I don't think it's a declaration as such, but I thought I would mention that.
Thank you. Now, that's a useful connection to establish. And item 4, matters to be considered in private. I don't think we have any this evening. So we're on to item 5, minutes of the previous meeting. Any corrections to be made, or are those that were present last year particularly happy to accept them as an accurate record? Okay, I'm seeing nods. Brilliant. So we have 2 substantive items tonight. We're first of all going to hear, I think, from Kevin and Emily on the budget strategy for 2025 to 2026 and the medium-term financial strategy. We'll be able to take some questions after that presentation, and then we'll move on to an update on business rates that will be led by Nick Rowe, supported by Paul Tyrrell. So without further ado, I'll hand the floor over to Kevin and Emily.
Turn on now. It's on. Everyone hear me? You hear me, Emily? You nod.
Yeah, we can hear you.
You can hear me over there. I'll just share the presentation. Presentation.
Whilst we're setting up the presentation, I'll just provide a bit more additional context for anyone that is listening to the recording after tonight, and that is to explain that tonight's meeting is, I think, a sort of statutory requirement for the local authority to sort of open up this sort of the planning exercise that is underway, so that the local business community can better understand what is in play, and I suppose the potential impacts, good and bad, for the business community in the year ahead. So we look forward to some good questions to follow over the next hour or so. But for a little while yet, we are going to resolve the technical glitches and get the slide deck up on screen, which will make the technical detail far easier to navigate, because there is an awful lot of detail when it comes to.
Have another go. Oh, right. Okay. Good. Right. Apologies for that brief problem. All sorted now, hopefully. My name is Kevin Kilburn. I'm the AD for Strategic Finance. I'm here with Emily Hill, who's the Executive Director for Resources, and also the Council's Chief Finance Officer. The Council published its Cabinet paper for the budget on the 4th of February, and the aim of this short presentation is just to go through the key highlights of that report. It's quite a long report, 50-odd pages long. So this presentation will go through the main parts of it. There we go.
Can
Kevin, just to let you know, I'm sharing because I thought I might
Well, you're
make it
sharing.
easier for you.
Oh,
Yeah.
right.
So if you let me know, I can tab on.
Thank you, Emily. I'm having all sorts of problems with my IT since I came down from upstairs. Three sections to the presentation. One is just to set the context of the budget, then how the council has or is proposing to balance the budget, and then finally some of the risks that the council faces and its resilience in managing those risks. So I'll start off now on the main presentation. So just to give a bit of background, the council is having to deal with some quite significant challenges and pressures, both in terms of its funding and historic funding for over a decade now, as well as having to cope with increasing demand for its key services and also costs in those services. The council, like many councils, have faced long-standing challenges, particularly in social care. That's in adult social care and children's social care, and in children in special educational needs as well. But this has been added to over the last 18 months, 2 years, with the problems around homelessness and the provision of temporary accommodation. That's become really acute in the last few months in this financial year, and we're expecting that to be the same in the new financial year too. The council has always been able to set a balanced budget, and as I'll come on to it, has been able to set a balanced budget in this year, but there are significant risks in that, as we'll come on to. The provisional settlement, which is what the government says we need to set a budget, provided some additional funding, but the vast majority of this was actually council tax rather than government grant, but which is the same everywhere. So the council proposes to balance its budget through additional income, but also savings opportunities, particularly in the demand-led services of adult social care, children's social care. But I suppose that has to be seen in the context that it's been about 14 years of savings, particularly in those areas. There's nothing easy now, it gets more and more difficult. So just to look at the funding for the last 10, 15 years, the core funding that we've received from central government. So this graph on the left-hand side shows our standard funding assessment. This is what the government, in effect, funds councils for and funds Ealing for. The blue line is the cash we've received. So back in 2013-14, the council received £167 million. This year it will receive 107. So a reduction of £60 million in cash terms. That cash leveled off. It decreased up until about 2018. Then, as you can see, it sort of leveled off from there. But in real terms, obviously, we've had inflation in that period as well. So in real terms, it's gone down even further, about £100 million. And then the chart on the right-hand side, that shows what's called the core spending power. The core spending power is the government's indicator of how much the councils have to spend, including council tax. And you can see while that fell in the first few years, up until about 2016-17, in cash terms, it's risen, but that's risen because of council tax. So that rise there, but in real terms, you can see it stayed flat. It hasn't increased at all, while the council has had to contend with increasing pressures in terms of demand. And that demand has been driven by a number of factors. One, the borough has seen an increase in its population of some 15% over that year. And in older adults, that's adults over the age of 65, over 20% more adults in that category. The number of households that the council serves has increased by 12%. But skipping to the bottom bullet point, what's really now outstripping that, which councils had to deal with for quite some time, is the issue of homelessness, which is driven by a number of factors. You can't put it down to one. The cost of living, geopolitical events, asylum policy, market regulation in the housing sector, and also high interest rates, all affecting supply of housing while demand increases. So you know what happens when that happens, when that occurs. Thank you. To give some context of the council's spending over the last 5 years, the blue bar there, you probably won't be able to see it. The blue bar is the proportion of council spending on adult social care, green on children's social care, and the purple on homelessness. The red on universal services, everything else. And we've included in here debt servicing as well. So in just 5 years, spending on adult social care, children's social care and homelessness, those big demand services, has increased from 46% of total council spend to 59% in just 5 years, with adult social care alone increasing from 22% to 30%. We've got that yellow block at the top there. That is the historic decisions on debt and capital financing. The council borrowed a lot to fund its capital expenditure over many, many years, because when the council borrows, it's often for something like 50 years. So this is a long-term issue, and that we have, like with our mortgages, we have to pay our mortgage first. So we have to pay the interest, and we have to repay those loans. So that creates a ceiling, in effect, on that. So what's happening there is the red block, which is the universal services, such as highways, waste, and other discretionary services, that's been squeezed in the middle. So that's what the council has dealt with, and in order to maintain a balanced and sustainable budget. Inflation. As we all know, inflation has fallen quite significantly over the last 12 months, but many of the contracts that the council have fixed, will have a fixed month when that happens. So it may be that some contracts have a much lower inflation rate, others, which are older, have a higher inflation rate in that, and we'll have to deal with that for the next 12 months. Obviously, hopefully it will come down in 26 and 27. Like all employers, but nearly all employers, having to deal with the increase in national insurance contributions, which will not only affect the council, but will affect many of its suppliers and providers of services as well. Thank you. So, yep. Oh, thanks, Emily. So to balance the budget, a number of things that I'll pick on as we go through in the next few minutes. All the ones in red on that chart are pressures. All the ones in green make it easier, are reductions in expenditure or increases in income to help us balance our budget. So the really big important ones there, just like to point out, I've said about inflation, which is the first three blocks there. And then there's been some technical issues as well that the council needs to respond to. One of the biggest ones in those is concessionary fares, the increase in concessionary fares. I can't remember what it's called now, the bus pass.
Freedom Pass.
Freedom Pass, yeah. As the effects of COVID and the lockdown wear off, more and more people are using public transport, more and more people in Ealing are using public transport, therefore the cost to the council of that is going up. But the really big block there, the really big block in red of nearly £28 million is the service pressures. And I'll come on to those in a bit more detail in a few slides' time. All that's offset then by a number of factors. We've increased fees and charges. Business rates are increasing, which will give us an extra £1.7 million. The number of homes that council can levy council tax on has increased, and that gives us nearly £2 million. And then there was a bit more government funding, as I said, in the provisional settlement, just over £3 million. And the government have also provided funding for the increase in national insurance, because national insurance increases partly to do with providing public services. Obviously, what the government wants to do is make sure that some of that funding goes back to public services to meet their own costs. And while it doesn't completely offset what we think the costs of our internal staff costs will be, it goes quite some way to meet that. What it doesn't meet, though, is the cost of our contracts and providers and services. There's some significant savings, particularly in the areas of children's social care and adult social care, to offset the pressures in those areas, leaving the council tax, the proposed council tax, to fill the gap, to bring that back down to a balanced budget. Thank you. So looking at some of the pressures at a high level in terms of where they are falling, you can see, not surprisingly, the two top ones there, adult social care and children's services, that's where the big pressures are being faced, not only in this year, but forecast to be increased further in the next, over the period of the medium-term financial plan. The other one there, the fourth one down, housing and environment, that's the name of the directorate, but what is driving that, not surprisingly, is temporary accommodation. That forms the vast majority of those pressures. Other pressures are then quite small in comparison to that. For future years, we've included under corporate pressures of £12 million. That's because we feel, looking at historic evidence and the pressures, that it could be something of that order, but we won't know that really until we get to more about this time next year, when services are looking at how they've done over the year and then what they're facing. So we're putting that in as a bit of a flag for the moment, so we're not presenting ourselves with too rosy a picture. But at the same time, I don't think it's a particularly pessimistic one either. One of the ways that the council can directly help itself is on the fees and charges it levies on the services it provides. The council provides a range of services. Where possible, we aim to increase those by inflation, but some fees and charges, particularly on housing, we're not able to increase it by the rate of inflation. There's a statutory cap on those. Where the council provides commercial services, it will look to provide a charge in line with the market, whether that's above inflation or below inflation. Okay, thank you. Yeah, so the local government finance settlement, we were the government announced what they called the provisional settlement just before Christmas on the 18th of December, and the final settlement was actually confirmed this week. So we haven't actually, I'll just say, there's very little change in the final and the provisional one. So the paper that is going to Cabinet next week, that was published on the 4th of February, we didn't adjust that for what it would have been. It'd be more work probably than the amount of money involved. Not quite, but it would have been quite a significant effort to get that out. So it doesn't make a lot of difference. Small increase in funding. Overall funding in the core spending power, which is the government's indicator of council spend, that increased by £16.2 million, 4.5%, against a national average of 6%. And the London average of, I say 5.5%, Emily, I think it was about that. But of that £16.2 million, the government expects the council to raise nearly 12 million of that through council tax. And that council tax will be by increasing it by nearly 5%. I'll say a bit more about that in a few slides' time. There's a net increase in government grants of 4.6 million. But most of that, in fact, 6.6 million of that increase was directed towards adult social care and children's social care. So you can see on everything else apart from those areas, there's been a reduction in government funding. Finally, on the settlement, this was hopefully the last year of it being a single year settlement. From 26 onwards, we should get a multi-year settlement, hopefully at least 3 years. The government have already issued the consultation on that in terms of what principles it should have in that in its review of local government funding. Areas it will be looking at of interest will be how we distribute, or how the government distributes that funding. And it's looking like more of a weighting towards deprivation. That's probably the main one. How will that affect Ealing? Probably fairly neutral in effect. While Ealing has quite a good ability to raise council tax, there are also significant areas of deprivation, so it's probably falling somewhere in the middle of those, but it'd be difficult to tell until all the information is there. And obviously we'll keep a very close eye on what happens on that. Thank you, Emily. Yeah, just moving on to savings. Some significant savings are being made. You saw in the chart before, nearly £22 million of savings. Vast majority coming from, well, half of that coming from children's services. It looks a huge amount, and it is a huge amount in children's services. The reason for that is there's been a bit of a reprofiling of savings which were due this year, which have been able to be met. So they're being made next year instead, and the service are gearing up to that and doing a lot of work on that. So some significant savings in children's, also in adults. That's where the main savings are being driven from. In other areas outside of housing, there's very little. There aren't much pressures there, as you saw, and very little to save as well. If you think back to that multicoloured sandwich chart, you saw how all those services were being squeezed and squeezed and squeezed. So on the council tax, the proposal is to increase the core council tax by 2.99%. Anything above that would trigger a referendum. But the council, if a council has social care responsibilities, it can increase the council tax by a further 2%. The council is proposing to increase it by the maximum 4.99% in that case. That would generate, in terms of the core council tax, an extra £5.5 million. What council tax Band D payers would be paying will be an extra £44 a year, or 85 pence a week. In addition to that, social care precept would generate an extra £3.7 million, nearly an additional nearly £30 a year. For the average Band D property, an extra 57 pence per week. Just very briefly, this is what the council's services look like at a very high level. I suppose the interesting thing there is that there is a small decrease in children's social care. That's because of the large amount of savings carried over from the current year to put it on track to where it needs to be. You can see a significant increase there in housing and environment, from just under 23 million to just under 30 million pounds. That's one of the big pressures. All of those pressures there on service departments, rising from by nearly 15 million pounds, are met by a number of areas, but mostly by additional funding, but also on corporate budgets as well. The corporate budgets that have fallen there, well, it's not really fallen, there's increased income we're getting in from the interest the council earns on its cash balances. The council's capital programme hasn't progressed as far as thought, so the money hasn't been spent, that cash balance is still sitting in the bank, and interest rates haven't fallen as quickly as was expected. I know they fell today and still expected to fall, and we've got that in. But we thought this time last year we'd be much further on that fall in interest rates, and we're not. So we're earning more cash on our balance. We're earning more interest on our cash balances. So just in summary, just two little pie charts to compare how the council funds its net revenue budget. So that the net revenue budget is all of its service expenditures and also its corporate expenditure. It funds that through business rates, council tax, and the revenue support grants that the government provides us. And you can see from the chart, the vast majority of that, 60% in 25-26, will be funded from council tax, with business rates funding the next biggest set of 33%. Some of the risks that the council is facing when it sets its budget. When Emily sets the budget, and she's written in the budget report about the robustness of the estimates, and also council's resilience on that. So we've taken into account the impact of inflation and interest rates in setting the budget, and our ability to manage any changes in that. So there is it wasn't clear in there that there is a contingency in there to meet any inflation above what there is at the moment. The Chief Financial Officer has to have regard to the robustness and delivery of the savings in there. So I've just highlighted the savings at a high level, £22 million, and all the plans to achieve that have been reviewed and assessed whether it is they are likely to be delivered. And the Council Finance will monitor those on a monthly basis throughout the year to check that they are delivered. We have risks in our partnerships and contracts, particularly on the capital side. Many businesses are facing, as is known, are facing difficulties, and the problem in partnerships and long-term contracts, if one of those partners goes bankrupt or hands back the contract, we're never going to get one as cheap again next time, because that's just not how the world works. The availability of our reserves, the council has been increasing its reserves for the last few years, but is still seen comparatively as a high risk council, even within London boroughs. There's the wider economic factors that will affect government funding going forward, but it also can affect and will affect our ability to raise income, something that Nick will come on to in a minute. And there's always risks around capital developments, investments, and the timing of capital receipts can affect our cash flow. I've just spoken about reserves. Thanks, Emily. We are estimating to have reserves of 140 million at the end of this financial year and going into next financial year. That's down about £5 million from last year. That's generally reduced in the area that we call in committed reserves. That's in our PFI reserves, redundancy reserves, money that's been set aside for a specific purpose, and we know we've had to spend that. Other reserves have tended to stay pretty much balanced. There was a small increase actually in the general balance because the council underspent by about £3 million last year, and that all went into general reserves, into the general balance. So I'm happy to leave that there. Happy to answer questions, and Steve may want to answer questions, and Emily may also be able to answer the questions as well.
Fantastic, thank you, Kevin. Councillor Donnelly, do you want to come in with any reflections at this point?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just a couple. Maybe I'll work backwards. We talked a little about the reserves and relative risk. It's one of those things. Getting your head round concepts of risk and reserves is quite a tricky one, because how much in reserves other councils, particularly in London, have had has been moving very swiftly up and down in the last couple of years. and we've moved more into mid-table in terms of our position, partly because for the last 3 years we deliberately put money in at £3.5 million a year, and partly because other councils have been spending their reserves in a way about which they're very uncomfortable. So they've gone down, we've moved up, relatively speaking. And I think part of the issue, we got issues like homelessness, which in the form that they currently are presenting, local authorities aren't really designed for. So we're coping with extremely untypical and difficult situations. And it's sort of like, in terms of our management of reserves, we can put in good fire doors, we can install sprinklers, but if a forest fire comes to your neighbourhood, none of that would be enough. So we do what we can within the context of what we can control. And I think I've always said, I think the solution to homelessness doesn't lie within local authorities, it lies within the national economy. The drivers to homelessness that Kevin was talking about, as they reduce, and we hope they will reduce, then the pressures on us in terms of the provision of temporary accommodation should reduce. But we're very fortunate tonight to be able to present a proposed balanced budget of the type we are, because not every council is in a position to do that. And the queue of councils to the department seeking assistance of one kind or another has been long. And even this week, Newham got permission for a 9% increase in council tax. We're sticking with the standard recent 2.99 plus 2 because we're a social care provider. And I think the move to a multi-year settlement we discussed last year, I do remember that. And I think that should provide significant benefits to all councils in terms of planning ahead. It's not a miracle solution, because if the world changes very quickly, it can leave you exposed if assumptions that were made around income and expenditure prove to be inaccurate. So there'll still be a requirement for a more interactive dialogue with government to ensure that we're in a position to deliver what our residents rightly expect and need, but also what we can afford. So I think I'd probably pause on that, and those are the highlights for me.
Thank you. And in those remarks, you've answered one of my questions, and in terms of your reflections on the multi-year settlement and what that might mean moving forward. Now, as always, I've got a few questions here myself, but first of all, online and indeed in the room, any questions for Kevin and Emily?
Chair, I have my hand up.
Okay, we'll go to Councillor Kumar, I think is first of all online, and then in the room.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted a little bit of clarification on the fees and changes around the 1.35, and also the contract inflation. Is that due to a change in contracts or increase in costs for those particular contracts? And lastly, on the business rates, I mean, I know that our officers, especially Nick and Emily, have handled it extremely well, because all the business rates people that came through and were not too pleased or think their rates are far too high, that's been dealt with really well. And that's only, really recently, because some of them were being charged a hell of a lot. So they're taking that up with the valuation agency. But as far as our officers are concerned, I want to thank them. I might as well add that comment in, because they resolved it, addressed it to the businesses satisfaction. And I'm sure there are a lot more out there. And just lastly, on the council tax increase, I mean, I know that on the collections, is that likely to increase under the current climate because of cost of living as well? And if that can be explained a little bit more, I'd be very happy to hear. Thank you.
Kevin and Emily, a bundle of questions there for you.
I'm happy to start off, but Emily can step in if, to add. On fees and charges, yeah, the £1.3 million increase, that's round about an inflationary increase of, so the inflation we had when we set in the budget and our funding was actually 1.7. It's set on the September's inflation, so it was down at 1.7% at that time. In terms of contract inflation, every contract is slightly different, and the timing of when there's an inflation clause will be slightly different. So if the clause said September 2024, the increase would be 1.7% in that contract, or it could be. But if it were set for January, for December, it will be up around about 2.1%. So you can see how it would change, and that will depend upon what month is in that contract. The council tax collection, it's probably best if I leave that for Nick and his presentation, unless you want to say something now.
I'll come in on council tax now if you want. Yeah, Councillor Kumar, you're quite right. Council tax collection is increasingly difficult. We have seen significant impacts from the cost of living. The tax assumption is still based on an assumed collection rate of 98%. Now, unfortunately, maybe a few years ago, we would collect 97, 98% during the financial year. But what we're actually seeing is people who are approaching us with financial difficulties, and we're making arrangements that take longer to pay, which helps the customer, but still guarantees our money. So yes, we will still get the target collection rate, but it does take a bit longer to get. But yeah, it won't affect the finances at all.
Emily.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I mean, I think officers have answered actually all the questions already. I think the fees and charges are differential depending on the specific service, and that has caused sort of that slight change from just the 1.7%. So within the Cabinet Papers is a long list. It's 36 pages because I review every one of all of the fees and charges. So you can see a differential rate and differential increases in some of those in relation to sort of costs or any other sort of behaviour changes that we want through fees and charges. In terms of contract, just to be sort of really clear, that contract inflation figure is where we do have a specified clause in the contract. So we do try to look at contracts and see whether we have a fixed price for the life of the contract, but certainly very long life contracts, often you pay more to have a fixed contract because the company will sort of price in risk of inflation early on. So that contract inflation is very specific. It's on a contract by contract basis by which we look at the specific index that we need to apply. I think the business rate probably will be picked up better through Nick and his presentation. Certainly we do look to support Ealing businesses as far as we can, but it's clearly a national scheme which we need to apply. But you're quite right, we try to give the best advice we can on appeals to the Valuation Office and other things. So thank you for your comments, Councillor Kumar. And on council tax, the only thing I would add is, as Nick says, across London, I think we are seeing that concern around collection. Some of that sort of not being able to collect that is offset by our sort of increasing council tax base as we have more homes come on, so it doesn't sort of adversely affect the budget too much. The other thing I would say is this council has continued to protect its council tax reduction scheme, so that's council tax support available to residents on lower incomes. And so as we've set the budget this year, we've made assumptions around the increases in that scheme. So again, that shouldn't adversely affect the budget, but clearly we don't know what the economy will do. The Bank of England has made a guess today and has tried to seek to counteract that. But definitely that sort of impact on residents and businesses in being able to pay their bills is one of the risks that I need to consider as I set that budget. We need to make prudent assumptions as to what we're going to be able to collect in what is quite a difficult environment and context.
Thank you, Emily. I think we've got another question in the room.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Kevin, Emily, and everybody on the team. Worked really hard on this. My question, kind of, you've touched upon it, but I just wanted to know whether the revised Bank of England estimates that were announced today will affect the projection in any way. And also, Councillor Donnelly, you kind of touched upon this as well. Where do we stand in comparison with our neighbouring boroughs? Like, how are we doing? Thank you.
I'll start on that. Yeah, the Bank of England presented a rather gloomy picture of the economy and reduced the forecast for growth today. That is one of the risks that we were showing really in there. So obviously it's difficult to predict everything that's going to happen, particularly with world events and how that may play out. But you know, we in setting the budget, we have reserves. We have set a contingency, but we also recognise that that may not be enough because we don't know what's going to happen. So yes, it will have an effect, but we don't know what it could be.
Okay, I think it might be my turn for a few questions, as I can't see any hands up online. Oh, Emily wants to come back in.
All right.
Sorry, Chair. I think there was just a second question there on sort of neighbouring boroughs as well. So just quickly back on the Bank of England point and the interest rates. We did and have forecast in a reduction in interest rates. I think most people thought it was going to come and will continue to come, but we were never quite sure when. But we did forecasting a drop in rates, so this announcement won't cause us to sort of need to change those budgets significantly. In relation to the neighbouring authorities, Councillor Donnelly has sort of given an indication that London particularly is struggling, particularly because of this homelessness issue. And it is outer London boroughs that seem to be struggling the most because they do have a sort of historical underfunding or less funding than inner London boroughs. So Councillor Donnelly mentioned Newham, but there are now seven sort of outer London boroughs who have sort of formally and in the public domain approached the department for what's called exceptional financial support. So they've said they are unable to balance their budgets and they need exceptional financial support from the government. So that's 7. And we know there are probably another 5 in discussions with government. So that gets on to almost half of London boroughs. So as Councillor Donnelly said, it is some achievement to have balanced the budget. I am, as Kevin has said, I have undertaken and written my personal statement on the robustness of estimates, and I am satisfied that the budget is balanced and robust. But there are significant risks around external demand and external pressures that mean that we need contingencies and we need reserves to enable us to manage those as they come through.
Go on.
Thank you. If I can just, Emily touched on boroughs seeking exceptional financial support, and it might be some on the call would think, well, why don't we just spend and then go to the government and say, look, we overspent, give us some money. I think we need to stress exceptional financial support comes at a cost, one way or another. It is not, I think most people in this meeting know what a cheque is. It's not a blank cheque. Not every forum I can use that metaphor anymore. Councils are expected to ultimately fund that extra cost one way or another, sometime or another. So the only responsible thing to do is to drive as hard as we can to make sure we don't get into that position. And in some cases, councils have got there by foolish decisions. In some cases, they've just been unlucky. And in many cases, people have tried to be too clever to think their way out of the pressures that everyone is under, and it's backfired on them. In some cases, it's just the erosion of the social care, the homelessness. They've just run out of road, and we don't want to be in that position.
I think we have too many case studies now of the impact on sort of local government when it's sort of gone into special measures and the severe cuts that have followed. Certainly want to avoid that scenario in this part of London. A few questions from me. I was intrigued you had on your sort of budget pressures in future years slide against housing and environment, there was a 0. And of course, that was one of the budget lines that has quite a spike this year. I wondered what your view was on the future outlook, therefore.
I'll start, Emily.
That's because the pressures around homelessness have come so quickly. I don't think it's fully understood. There's a whole range of different factors behind it. The service, to be honest, are trying to manage that at the moment rather than looking too far ahead. Corporately, as you saw, one of the pressures we put in right at the bottom there, £12 million a year, just pressures that we think, both Emily and I think, are going to be there or somewhere around there. Hopefully not that high, but we can't tell. So, but that's looking into the future. We don't really have to make those decisions just yet, but it's worth flagging them now so that when we are planning for the future, we are building in those pressures. But we don't exactly know what they are.
I mean, it's clearly been hard to balance the books this year, and I guess year on year it's getting harder. Be intrigued to know more around the savings in children's services. It sounded like you'd sort of been able to carry forward or into this year some savings you were already sort of delivered. But what does that mean in practice, I suppose, for beneficiaries of those services?
Children's services savings cover a whole range, not only of their services, but a range of different projects to look to reduce costs where they can, to contain demand where they can, and improve efficiencies in the service. So that's where a lot of that comes from. There's a lot on staffing. There's a lot on what they call the front door, to be able to access services to start with. But that's always contentious, isn't it? Because it is somebody's child.
All right, go on, Emily. Yes.
Thanks. Perhaps I can add. So in relation to children's services, I think it's sort of important to sort of note and recognise that children's services this year had an Ofsted inspection, and they are very big events for children's services across the country. So we got a very good result, and that is excellent, but those things take a lot of time and capacity, and so good plans that were had in place for this year have needed to be deferred whilst that inspection took priority, and then they're moving on. So some of the savings for next year are sort of a deferral of this year's savings. As Kevin has said, a number of those are staffing savings. Some of those we hope to sort of be enabled through digital innovation. So in fact, some of our social workers were at an AI event in Downing Street this week. Actually, it was our adult social care using AI tools that sort of streamlines the administration work they do, so they have more time with residents or their older people or people with learning difficulties, rather than doing the administration. So a number of these savings are looking at sort of streamlining those processes, improving practice, and reviewing practice as well. Another area in children's is commissioning. We have children in placements that can cost up to £1 million a year. They cost a lot of money and they're not necessarily the best outcomes for children. So one of the big pushes within the department is to try to increase the number of in-house foster carers. They are better placements for our children and young people and better outcomes, and very much cheaper than those where you put children in secure children's homes or other children's homes. So some of this is about changing, trying to change, as far as we're able to change the market, purchasing and commissioning of placements. So there isn't expected to be significant sort of deterioration, as you said, for those sort of families and children and young people. It is around buying better, being more efficient, and organising our services in a way that still gets the outcome. So there's no significant sort of deterioration of or service cuts, really, just redesigns of services and better purchasing. That there will be changes in services, but with a view to sort of continue and maintain outcomes or improve outcomes, rather than any sort of hard cuts, as it were, in those services. They're more difficult to cut, like those universal services, because we continue to have really clear statutory duties for those children and young people. And the DCS, the Director of Children's Services, will always have a statutory duty to ensure that they maintain those minimum services to keep those children and young people safe.
Thank you, Emily. And in fact, that case study you cited, is it Beam, the AI software that you've been adopting? I spotted it came up on LinkedIn yesterday with the visit of staff to Downing Street.
That's it, exactly.
I mean, the point you raise on foster care, I mean, I think in terms of the connections to the local business community is perhaps one for us to pick up with the likes of Alan Rides and West London Chambers and others, perhaps after the meeting, in terms of what the business community can be doing to support foster carers and indeed promote that pathway. But I suppose one final question and reflection from me, and that is, I wonder whether there is an iteration of this slide deck that could sort of draw out some of the business-facing services and how investment in those areas is shifting over the years. Is that it wasn't completely apparent, and certainly for the conversations I have with local businesses, I suspect Alan too, that some of the predictable sort of daily gripes are of more potholed roads, as inevitably spending in some of those non-statutory areas gets squeezed, the availability of business support getting squeezed as sort of national and local funding reduces. And I think we should be transparent with the business community about that reality in the context of statutory services having to be protected. Emily.
So I think that's absolutely right. And actually there has been sort of another iteration of work where we've said, yes, obviously the budget report that we put always talks about the changes. It doesn't actually continue to sort of set out the areas that we continue to invest in, including those discretionary services, because you're right, the sort of move is towards a statutory minimum, which is also difficult to define. But certainly, and it's sort of exactly the area you talked when you saw Kevin's graph of, I call it the squeezy graph, where you see the universal services in the middle going down from 45% to I think 25, but those universal services, those sort of more discretionary type services have been squeezed. But actually I think this budget has protected those universal services. We don't see anything like reductions in street cleaning on high streets and things like that. We haven't seen any reduction this year in highways budgets. So actually this year we've really focused, I think, as Kevin has suggested, on adults, children and homelessness. They spend the most part of the council budget, and we've had to focus the savings on those areas, because frankly at this point you could almost wipe out the budgets on the universal services and they still wouldn't be enough. So actually I think this budget this year has looked to protect those. One of the things very clearly that we've sort of looked at is our council's regen growth and regen team, who I'm sure you all know well, Connor, Peter, and those services are discretionary. I'm sorry, I'm echoing a little bit, so I hope I'm not echoing with you. Those services are discretionary, and they are the areas where, in a position where the council would be going to seek exceptional financial support, the government would expect us to cut those. But with the budget in front of you today, we've looked to protect those. I think in the savings schedules, you shouldn't see any significant reductions in those. And certainly, both in terms of the government missions and this administration's, that sort of economic growth is a priority. So we have retained sort of quite significant discretionary spending in economic development and those areas, and certainly in street cleansing and waste.
Brilliant. So some good news in there tucked away for our business community. On that note, should we move on to one final reflection? We'll keep moving and save any final questions or reflections till after Nick Rowe and Paul's update on business rates. Over to you.
Speaker on. Thank you very much. I'm Nick Rowe, Assistant Director of Local Taxation and Accounts Receivable. And with me, I've got Paul Tyrrell, who is the Business Rates and Control Manager. So if there's any really technical questions, Paul's the man to answer them on business rates. We'll give you a quick update. This is a business rates presentation, but I thought I'd just pick up on one point, Chair, on foster care carers and care leavers. Ealing has always funded a local exemption for care leavers. And one of the things that we've covered in the budget, one of the items coming in from April 25, is we are now going to grant an exemption to foster carers as well. So subject to approval at full council, that'd be the first time Ealing has offered that, which I think is a really positive step forward as well.
Sorry, Nick, before I actually continue in this meeting, I'm sorry to interrupt. I just want to make a declaration that I am a business rates payer. So if I'm supposed to leave, I will leave this presentation. I'm not sure.
No, not at all.
Fine to stay.
No, this is hopefully the presentation is aimed at, so good to have you here. So very brief bit of background about Ealing. As I think we always say, Ealing business is a key part of the economy. We've got almost 11,000 businesses in the borough, and they are the ones who are actually ratepayers, with a further 6,000 businesses who don't have their own properties but are still active businesses. We are a large borough in terms of business rates. In terms of the amount collectible, we're the 13th largest in London and the 20th largest in England, 8th largest in terms of number of properties. So what we are seeing, a lot of other boroughs are seeing, and I think given the size and the profile of the borough, it does allow us to have those discussions with central government on some of the changes, some of the developments as well. So hopefully we are getting the information and feeding into changes which not only benefit the council but will benefit ratepayers. We do know of the ongoing impacts of cost of living. It's probably very just about recovering from COVID, and then cost of living crisis came along, and we know businesses are suffering, and Paul's dealing with businesses on a daily basis to try and assist them with those issues. So in terms of business rates changes for next year, the multiplier will be increased by CPI. So it will go from 54.6 to 55.5p in the pound. The small business multiplier, which are those businesses with a rateable value of less than 51,000, will be capped once again by central government. So that's the same as the last 3 years, will be capped at 49.9p. For those businesses with a rateable value over £75,000, so with slightly larger businesses, there is still the Crossrail supplement, which sits in at 2p in the pound. So, and that will remain for the foreseeable at the moment from the GLA. A couple of new measures that the government have announced in the autumn statement, which have now come through. First one being private schools. They always got charitable relief. That has been ended. So from the 1st of April 2025, private schools will pay the rates bills the same as any other business. And Probably slightly more contentious and will certainly impact a number of our businesses. Retail discount for retail outlets, which currently sits at 75%, will drop to 40% from April 2025. And again, that's a central government measure. With council tax, we have a degree of flexibility in what we can do. For business rates, we're very much controlled by central government. So unfortunately, that is something that will come, and people will see increased bills from next year, or from April this year. So we've talked about the multipliers already, the 1.6% increase for standard multiplier. When we talk about retail relief, as we can see, the change at the bottom, the 25, 26 going to 40%. Now, I think the difficulty is that has chopped and changed that retail relief discount. Starting off at the 33%, then went to 50, then when COVID came in, we had those year of multiple changes with reliefs varying drastically. We're now settling in at 40%. I think one of the issues we've got at the moment with the business rate space is I think retail businesses have got more or less an expectation of getting that relief, but that is something that the government do grant year on year. So we do just need to be aware of that. But we'll come on to some of the future changes in a minute. That relief is paid to all businesses, although there is a cash cap of £110,000 per annum. And it's also subject to state aid rules, which is 315,000 over 3 years. So that obviously impacts some of the larger retail outlets. I've said already, no relief for private schools from this year. So looking forward to next year, as in April 2026, the government has announced there will be some significant changes to business rates going forward. So the first one is they are going to introduce new permanently lower multipliers for retail, hospitality and leisure properties with a rateable value under 500,000. So effectively, as I said, at the moment, the retail relief is granted year on year by government. That will then be put into statute legislation. So it will give some certainty to retail outlets and not have this waiting each year to see what the government are going to announce. The cost of that will be funded by those businesses with a rateable value over 500,000. So we're talking about, we've probably got 20 in the borough at the moment. They will pay a surplus or a supplementary charge, which will fund that retail relief for the smaller businesses. So again, that will allow the economy to focus on the small, medium enterprises rather than these, you know, some of the superstores and some of the national chains. There will be a new revaluation from April 2026. The process has already started. It will be based on the property values as at the 1st of April 2024. So you will be getting a new rateable value for next year, which will probably come through towards the end of this calendar year. Yeah. Yeah. So at the moment we have 2 multipliers. What all this means that from next year there will now be 5 business rates multipliers. So if anything, a lot of this talk from central government was about simplifying business rates. It's probably doing the opposite in some ways, because now businesses are going to have to work out which multiplier they're paying. And there they are listed: the current small business multiplier, the current standard multiplier, which we have at the moment. Then for retail businesses, there will be a small multiplier for retail who will be paying even less than the other 2. The new retail, hospitality and leisure standard multiplier, which again will be lower than the standard multiplier, and this new higher multiplier where they will have even larger bills. Now, we will do everything we can in the coming year to simplify this as much as we can. So when it comes to billing for next year, we will be able to explain to businesses what that means for them personally. So Paul particularly is working through the legislation, looking at the impacts and how we're going to be able to manage this going forward. So all of this is coming via new legislation which will change the Government Finance Act, and the actual rates of the multipliers, the figures, will be set at the budget next year. Okay. So just some brief information about business rates. As always, business rates bills will be issued. We're processing them over the weekend of the 1st of March, and the bills will be issued around the 7th of March with the first instalment date of the 1st of April, and they will be payable over 12 monthly instalments now for all new bills. We do have some long-standing businesses who are still paying over 10 monthly instalments from April to January. If anyone is in that boat and wants to change their payment profile to 12 instalments, we can do that, as we can for council tax as well. So if anyone does want to spread those payments, please just contact the business rates team and we will get that done. So just to give you an idea of the amount of debt, as Kevin alluded to, the fact that the amount of debt we're collecting is going up each year. This year, the amount of debt that we're being asked to collect as a team is 176.4 million, up from 158.9 million last year. So you can see year on year there are significant increases in the amount of debt. Unlike council tax, we don't get to keep as much of the money. So for council tax, the money we're collecting is shared between ourselves and the GLA. We retain about 80%. It varies year on year depending on how much charges have gone up. However, for business rates at the moment, we only retain 30% of the revenue. The other money goes to the central government 33% and the GLA 37%. And that's changed a number of times over the various years. There was a pilot with 100% retention between ourselves and GLA. There's been some other splits over time as well. But I think that's one of those things that we are acting as a certain extent as a collection agency, not just for ourselves, but for GLA and central government as well. Final thing to say is the Ealing discount scheme for living wage employers. In 2016, we introduced the discount scheme for businesses accredited with the Living Wage Foundation, and a discount with twice the cost of the living wage accreditation. If anyone has become accredited, please do contact us and we can then sort out that discount. I do understand that there is also a scheme which will be promoted this year, which will be aimed at businesses who are paying the living wage and are accredited, but aren't necessarily business rates payers. And again, information on that scheme will be included with your business rates bills for the year going forward. There's our contact details. Anything at all, please contact myself or preferably contact Paul. But more than happy to take any queries anytime. And I think, as we've said before, if you have any other meetings or business groups that you want us to come and speak to, particularly with some of the changes that will be coming next year, we're more than happy to come out and give presentations and try and explain to people what the actual new scheme will be doing as well. Okay, and that's it from me.
Thank you, Nick. Now, I think that suggestion of some presentations later in the year as those changes start to come close is a sensible one, because whilst it's more nuanced, which probably be a good thing, certainly more complexity to navigate too. Questions, folks, online or indeed in the room?
Sorry, Chair, I seem to have a lot of questions tonight. About the Ealing discount scheme, do we know how many businesses are currently registered on that?
Not a huge number. I think at the moment we're talking about 23 or 24. So they are what we tend to do. We do work with the Living Wage Foundation and get updated lists. So we do cross-check, and then we would approach a business who isn't claiming the discount to make sure that they are aware of the scheme and do wish to claim it.
And is that a recurring discount or
No,
a
it's
one-off?
a one-off. We
Okay.
are looking at the scheme and how it can be amended going forward, but at the moment it's just a one-off to cover the first 2 years of accreditation.
Thank you. Alan first and then Tony. We might take both of your questions and then come to officers.
Okay, thank you very much. The presentation was superb. I've got 2 questions, I guess, so I'll get my money's worth all in one package. The first one is the number of businesses in the borough of Ealing since 2017 has been going down. What's the forecast for going forward, and how does that impact the bills that get paid? Secondly, we're working closely with the council on the London Living Wage scheme, and we're driving up those numbers, especially after last year's Ealing Festival of Business, where we captured the details of quite a few companies, hundreds of companies in the Ealing area who all said that they'd be interested in that scheme. So watch out, you could see a sudden influx of people claiming, especially if as I hope you don't mind, I took a screenshot of your final page that talked about where you can contact people for that. Thank you.
Perfect. And Tony.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. My question really is around the rates and the data centres that are coming online as well, and will they be subject to that plus £500,000 rates charge?
Okay, so picking up on Alan's questions first, yes, please do share the details. I think the slides with the agenda pack as well, and we're always happy to have any contacts or engagements, so that would be great. Regarding number of businesses, I mean, ironically, last year, compared with the 1st of April 1st of January this year compared with the 1st of January last year, the actual number of business rates properties only went down 23, but that isn't to say that what we tend to see is huge amounts of splits and mergers on properties. So what may have been one huge, we call it hereditament as a property, may have been one huge property and paying one extremely large rates bill, now ends up in 20 different assessed units, each paying their own individual rates demand. So it's very difficult for us to track the number of operating businesses on those changes. The overall rateable value always goes down year on year, and that's because of people who have had successful appeals to the Valuation Office Agency. So, for example, in terms of rateable value, we actually went up last year by 2 million, but that's very unusual on a year. I think I share these stats with Emily on a monthly basis, and we always see month on month, we've got a certain amount of provision for appeals, and that is being hit all the time by people who have had successful appeals against their banding, as Councillor Kumar stated earlier, and we do, try and encourage that and work with people so they are paying the correct rates bills for the size of the property. Tony, to move on to your question, data centres, yes, exactly. Any data centre that's over a £500,000 RV would be paying that increased multiplier from April 2026. I think one of the difficulties we have at the moment is if, for example, you had a business with a rateable value of 450,000, you probably wouldn't be too worried about paying that increased charge. But obviously we've got a revaluation coming next year, so we don't know what the impacts of reval are going to be. Ealing saw some very large increases in some of the sectors following the last revaluation, probably more than most boroughs did. And I think the Valuation Office put it down to the Thames Valley corridor impact, a lot of which was based around the impacts of Crossrail. So we're not sure what's going to happen this year. We'll work as closely as we can with the Valuation Office Agency, and any figures we can get, we will share in the public domain as soon as we get them.
Great, thank you.
We've got some of the highest land prices for industrial in the country in Park Royal, so
yeah,
that could
exactly. Yes.
flow through. And I was struck, I read the figures that you put up on screen correctly earlier, that this is possibly the first time since pre-pandemic that what you're collecting has kind of overtaken where you were
Yes,
back in
yeah.
2019, which is quite striking. Anyone for any more? Come on in. Thank you.
Hi everyone, good evening. I'm here just to introduce myself and my company. I'm Mohammed Ziad. I'm from Malabar Gold and Diamonds. I don't know how many of have spotted on that we are coming up with our London, UK store in Southall. We are the 6th largest jewelry retailer in the world, with over 375 stores in 13 countries. So it's a $6 billion company basically, and we started off our operations 30 years back in our hometown in India, and then we've grown drastically over the past 30 years, just because of the trust we gained from our customers. And the service and the products we provide to the customers. So that's made us so huge in the past 30 years. So we have 2 major operations. One is in India, India takes care of around 200 stores. And then international, we have a headquarters in Dubai, which handles 12 other countries. And we are still expanding further regions. So we have 175 stores in these 12 countries, apart from Indian operations. So finally, we are in the UK. So we wanted to open our first store in the UK in Southall actually a couple of years back, but due to the delay in property exchange, it got delayed, and then we started off with our plan B and C. So we have opened a store in East London, Green Street, almost a year back. And then within a year, we started the second store in Leicester. So now Southall is almost getting ready. So we are nearly there. Probably in a couple of weeks, we'll be opening the store. It's an iconic building there in the whole street. I think it was owned by a very old Indian bank called Bank of Baroda, which was there for the past 40-50 years, I think. So we have taken over that building now. And and this we are fairly new to this country. So this is my first kind of appearance to a council meeting and sitting in front of so many of these councillors. So we have received an email from the Ealing council inviting for this venue. So I thought to just present myself and give you an introduction about it.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Have you introduced the business, and we should, I suppose, say welcome to Ealing, Southall, and West London. And I suspect many people online and in the room tonight would be very interested to come to the opening when that occurs in a few weeks' time. So, thank you.
So we need a lot of help and support from the council. So I don't know how to start with and what to ask for, but like I said, we are pretty much new to this place. So,
well, you've got lots of connected people in the room, so we can share contact details after the meeting's closed and help you get the word out.
Yeah.
So,
all right.
Thank you. So I think no more questions that I can see in terms of the business rates presentations. I think it's really for me just to say a huge thank you to councillors, officers for extensive presentations and patiently taking all the questions that you've had to field, and those online with us tonight. We don't yet have a date for the next meeting, but I'd imagine it will be approximately this time next year. I've got one more hand up in the room, councillor.
Sorry, I just had a message from Councillor Mahfouz. His bike got nicked and he was meant to be here tonight, but when he came out of work, he couldn't get here. So he sent his apologies.
We will note his apologies and wish him luck in replacing the bicycle, hopefully with a locally made one, if I can say that. So thank you all once again, and a safe journey home. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Thanks,